The technologies used in libraries are in many ways influenced by the trends seen in the technology sector, which is why we explored the missions and practices of large tech companies in the previous section. Innovations in online searching, communications, artificial intelligence, and other areas usually start rolling out in popular culture first, and then are adapted for library usage later. In this section on libraries and user data, I'll present some information on how libraries and library vendors interact with user data and what it means for all parties involved. In a 2010 review, Trina Maggi found that the privacy policies of major vendors of online library resources failed to express a commitment to many of the standards articulated by the library profession and the information technology industry for the handling and protection of user information. You can see on the left a table from the American Library Association listing their policies and positions on different topics, from confidentiality and user privacy to the retention of library usage records. Overall, ALA recommends strict privacy practices when it comes to user data, including keeping the names of users confidential, informing users on how their data is being used and retained, and limiting how much identifiable information is collected and disclosed. Library organizations like ALA have strongly worded policies and often issue statements opposing government data collection, but libraries routinely work with vendors who benefit from library users' data. In this study, Maggi found that vendors would provide notice about data collection and sharing, but did not let users control what happens to their information. So once the library contracted vendor services, users who needed those services had no choice but to submit their data to the vendor. Vendors also didn't specify how they protect user information and offered no clear way for users to report if they feel like the terms of the vendor's policy have been violated. In this article, Maggi writes that librarians would be wise to remember that some of the vendors from whom they buy library databases are also in the business of selling personal information. For example, LexisNexis sells various marketing lists with titles such as consumer, homeowner, and relatives and roommates. The LexisNexis database that generates these lists has records on over 225 million consumers and 118 million households, with a superior depth of demographic and lifestyle indicators. And other vendors, such as EBSCO Publishing, belong to parent companies whose mission is vastly different from that of the library. EBSCO Industries is a conglomerate that includes a fishing lure manufacturer, a specialty office and computer furniture retailer, a real estate company, and a rifle manufacturer. Even if these vendors' business practices in libraries differ from their practices in other industries, and it's not clear that they do, we should recognize that these vendors are part of larger systems and report to boards and shareholders who do not necessarily have a direct interest in protecting library users' data and privacy. SPARC is a nonprofit advocacy organization that supports systems for research and education that are open by default and equitable design. They often focus on advocacy for open education, and in the process sometimes report on issues related to user data and privacy. In 2021, SPARC reported on how LexisNexis signed a multi-million-dollar contract with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Their databases, many of which are popular in libraries of all kinds, offer an oceanic computerized view of a person's existence, and they will provide the agency with the data it needs to locate people with little, if any, oversight. Library subscriptions fund these systems of surveillance. LexisNexis parent company RELX and Thomson Reuters have built online tracking systems that aggregate user data and then sell the services to others, including governments and law enforcement. From the Washington Post, says that this is an example of how government agencies have exploited commercial sources to access information they are not authorized to compile on their own. SPARC has seen large vendors reject libraries' suggested contract language related to privacy and insist on their own more permissive clauses. Another area of concern for libraries and user data is how learning analytics has become a routine way to track user activity and influence library services. On the left, you see a screenshot from Wikipedia defining learning analytics as the measurement, collection, analysis, and reporting of data about learners and their contexts for purposes of understanding and optimizing learning and the environments in which it occurs. It sounds like a noble endeavor, but often includes tracking when and from where users log into learning management systems, what web pages they click on, how long they spend on those web pages, and so on. Tracking in this area also extends to physical location, mapping out when and where students swipe into the library or other locations on campus for various purposes. Briney 2019 reviewed data management practices in academic library learning analytics. 54 published studies were compared to the National Information Standards Organization's principles on digital privacy. There is a caveat here that of the articles reviewed, many were inconsistent in reporting their data practices, which is a problem on its own. But for 26 studies, they had retained user data longer than normal, or indefinitely long, in order to use it for analytics studies. Only 2 studies explicitly discussed deleting data at the end of a project. And the longer libraries hold on to sensitive information, the greater risk that it can be accessed via legal or illegal methods. Many analytics projects range campus offices and campus datasets and aren't concerned with data minimization, which is only collecting what is absolutely necessary. Instead, they try to gather and analyze all types of data from physical card swipes to student website clicks. Studies might attempt to anonymize or de-identify data, but they're flawed at doing so. Key demographic info can still be identifiable without a name or student number. Sweeney 2000 said that 87% of Americans are uniquely identifiable by the combination of their birth date, zip code, and gender. Improper anonymization can harm already marginalized populations. Removing names and ID numbers are not sufficient to protect small subpopulations of users, especially in studies that only have a handful of responses from one ethnic group. Only 3 of 54 studies analyzed data on students who opted into the study. Only 1 study had an opt-out mechanism, and 0 studies described any way for patrons to receive the raw data that was used in the study. Take a moment to consider what other types of user data issues in libraries you have experienced. For example, have patrons ever been unaware or surprised about how their data is used or not used?